So on to the waistband. Checking to see if the notches are clipped. First, to fold it in half lengthwise. Make sure those notches are right on top of each other. And if there are some that aren't clipped, just be sure to clip them. Just a tiny amount, 1/8 of an inch. So pressing the waistband with the wrong sides together. And a piece of interfacing for later. This is hair canvas. You can use all kinds of things. You can use cotton, stiff cotton. You can buy interfacing. You can use fusible if you'd like. I just don't want to use any fusible in these garments that I'm teaching you. Later on, when I teach more sportswear, we'll go over fusibles. The piece of hair canvas that I'm using has no seam allowance. It's just the length and the width of the finished waistband. Now I'm aligning the center or the edge of the skirt to the first notch. There's also a center front notch, but this is the notch from the very edge of the waistband. I guess it's about 1/2 of an inch in. And then aligning the side seams notches. See, there's a little gap, a little excess in the skirt, so that will be eased in. You can see how it kind of bows up. Finding the center back notch and aligning it with the center back notch of the skirt. The other side seam. And on the left side of the front skirt, aligning the edge of the skirt with that first notch on the waistband, which is the notch for the seam allowance that extends past the skirt. I'm not totally convinced that my centers of the back from side to side seam and center back are the same. So if you put your side seams together, as I am with my left hand, and then find the center of the waistband and the center of the skirt, now you know it's perfectly matched down both centers. Now I'm going to cut the threads that I'm not going to pull. The threads that I'm not going to pull are on the right side of the fabric. I'm pulling from the lining side, the side that's facing me. So I have a caught stitch, so I'm going to pull a couple out so I can get to them and gently pull them and ease that fullness in. You will learn over time to distribute the fullness where you want it to be. Most women do not want it in the center front of their skirt or the center back. We put it basically in the apex of the bust area. In other words, down the princess seam area is where you want most of your fullness to go so that the body looks trimmer. Once happy with the gathering or easing, then start to anchor it with some pins. As you noticed, I pulled in both directions to make sure that the two lengths, the waistband and the gathered skirt, fit, that they're the same length. They've kind of been pulled into shape. Now, to stitch this down, making sure I only get the one layer of the waistband, and this is a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Some of the gathering stitching fell below the seam line, so I'm going to pull that out. And now to continue, I'm going to press the seam so that it kind of helps that seam allowance stay going up into the waistband. Makes it nice and flat as well and embeds all the stitching. What you see is I'm putting the iron in some places right under the waistband. Yep, and then on top of it to make that nice crease where the seam is. I want to finish the edge of the waistband, the bottom of the waistband, rather than turning it up to create another layer inside the waistband. I'm going to let this edge hang straight down with a finished edge of hem tape. So I'm taking the length of the waistband in hem tape. This is a soft rayon hem tape, and pressing it in half with just a fraction. One side's just sticking out a little tiny bit more than the other side. And you really can't not do this on, I couldn't use this on a curved seam. This has to be done on a straight seam or a fairly straight seam like the side seams of the skirt. It's basically the same thing. Okay, so I take the short edge and wrap it around the raw edge of the waistband. And try and get that waistband, the blue fabric, right up against the fold. And if the long edge of the hem tape is under, when you stitch, it'll catch both sides. I marked the side seam. Marking center back. These pins will probably help me fold the waistband down and make sure it's folded properly. Marking the side seam, making sure the pin is out of the way of the needle. Trimming off the excess. And now to set the interfacing in. I'm setting the edge of the hair canvas right up against the seam line. And if you notice, I'm putting it, note the orientation. It's on top of the seam allowance, and when the waistband is folded up, the seam allowance will be behind the interfacing. That helps buffer the seam allowance when you go to press the waistband. The seam allowance won't be bulky, won't show as much as if I put the interfacing behind the seam allowance. And note that I also did not put the hair canvas to the very edge of the waistband. That very last ½ inch is just seam allowance, so it does not need interfacing inside it. Clearly the interfacing is a little longer than it needs to be, so I'm determining where to cut it and cutting the excess off. Now you can see if I fold it over like this and finish those edges, it's going to be nice and smooth. So for now, I'm going to baste with long hand stitches the interfacing to the waistband, close to the fold of the waistband, so it's up at the top area of the interfacing. This will just hold it down so I can finish the waistband and it won't flip-flop and be creased so that it creates bulk instead of being flat. And now to finish the edge on either side, I'm going to fold the waistband along the pressed crease and put a tiny little snip because that helps it stay where you want it to be when you sew it. And I'm folding it, flipping it over so it's right sides together and stitching at the edge of the skirt. And remember, if your sewing machine is not good for back tacking, don't back tack. Some machines pull the fabric in such a way that it bunches it up. I'm just back tacking 1 or 2 stitches and my machine works really well this way. But if yours doesn't, just leave long tails and tie off the threads. And to do the same thing on the other side, folding it, I'm going to press this particular side first. Using a point turner. This is a really nice wooden one. Press that seam open And if it helps, you can clip the fold of the fabric in the seam allowance. Just like this. Clip it, press it open. And then turn it. Use a point turner if it helps. And get a nice crisp corner. You can see how I'm turning the very edge in. That way it will not show when the skirt is being worn. Checking for extra bulk. If there's a lot of bulk in the seam allowance, you can grade your seams by cutting one or two of the layers at different widths. But this seam allowance doesn't seem to be too bulky. Just measuring to be sure I've sewn it correctly. Giving a little notch at the correct fold, turning it right sides together, and the seam allowance that's sewn is going up to the folded edge. The seam allowance that is wrapped with seam tape is going down. So the seam allowance, the edge of the waistband, trim, clip the fold, press the seam open. Again, pressing the corner in so that when the skirt is being worn, that doesn't come into sight. And now those straight pins at the side seams and center back come in handy because it helps me make sure I'm folding the waistband down correctly. Sometimes it's easy to pull the waistband so it's kind of at an angle inside the skirt and it doesn't lay nicely. Checking the widths before I give it a final press. Using a press cloth and some good steam and heat to set that fold. And you can see that there's no lump where the seam allowance is. And that's because the interfacing was put closest to the outside of the garment inside the waistband. clearly I'm not happy with this corner. It tended to be a little bit too wide, just a fraction, so I'm going to re-sew that edge. You'll find that some fabrics shift more than others when you work with them, so you just have to constantly check your measurements so that when you're done, the garment looks very professional. It's easy to forget to check both sides of the waistband where the edges are, finish the garment, and then realize that one is a little bit taller or shorter than the other, and then have to go back. So if you can remember to check these as you go, it'll make things much easier. I'm pulling out the basting that's holding the interfacing up. Now to edge stitch. Make sure you have a long tail of the thread hanging behind the sewing machine, because you'll need to pull this through to the wrong side and tie it off or weave it through. And I'm embedding the needle very close to the seam on the waistband. I find some reference, like the inside of the foot or something, to align my stitching with as a guide. And with a normal stitch, I'm going to stitch all the way to the other side of the waistband. When you get to the end of the stitching, be sure to leave a long tail. I'm going to pull the top thread through to the bottom. And weave it through. You could also tie it, but a knot right here at the waist is likely to be rubbed a lot when the skirt is buttoned or against the body, and even though the knot wouldn't bother the body might actually untie the knot. So in this case, I think it's a lot better just to weave the threads through. And then take a needle and thread, and just on the inside where the facing, the vertical facing or the front edge of the skirt meets the waistband, if you'll sew that hem tape down, then it won't be problematic again when being buttoned and worn. You can imagine that if it moves up and down, in ironing it or just wearing it, it could create bulk by flipping the opposite direction. This stabilizes it and makes it look really tidy. And to do the same thing with the other side. Now let's take a look at it. The top stitching is really nice, but I think I want 2 rows of stitching around the waistband and down the front edge so that the top and bottom of the waistband will be top stitched. After you watch me do this, you'll realize that you could do it in a different sequential manner. It doesn't have to be done exactly like I'm doing it. I just didn't really plan ahead for the top stitching. I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted until I could see some of it. And on this side, what I can do is just jump the seam of the waistband and continue straight down the front edge. When I planned this skirt, if I had decided to do as much top stitching, what I would have done is done both the inner and outer edges of the facing before I put the waistband on, and then applied the waistband, and then done all the way around all four sides of the waistband. And now to do what is the left side of the front skirt, the final stitching against the edge of the front. I'm doing, it's actually a back stitch, going back behind the thread that comes out. It just helps lock it in a little bit. Pinning the waistband together, right over left. Buttonholes go on the right for women's clothing. So we'll take a look at the skirt and then make the buttons and buttonholes after determining the spacing.